Magic is an intensely personal exercise, initiate. No two mages weave their spells in exactly the same way. Like painting or sculpting, each artist has their own distinctive style. Imagine an elaborate lock with thousands of tumblers. The master locksmith must learn their sequence and sensitivity before they can devise a key.
Magic is a fundamental part of the Elder Scrolls universe, and recently I've been extremely interested in finding out more about it. See, a magic system, if done well, can be extraordinarily compelling, and there were questions that I always had about the magic of the Orbis. Initially, my main goal in investigating the magic system was to figure out the restraints that came with it, as learning the rules and restraints of a magic system is the key to knowing how to play around with them. That initial line of inquiry has led me down a path of knowledge seeking that will hopefully cover everything that you could ever be curious about in Nirn considering the systems of magic. Some key points we'll be talking about are: what is magic and why does it exist? Where does magic come from and why does it come from there? Does magic always require a somatic component such as hand usage or gestures? What is the nature of the soul? Why are the schools of magic broken up the way they are, and is it arbitrary in the end? Why are things like shouting and necromancy not considered schools of magic, yet destruction and restoration are? Are magic and science different fields in the Elder Scrolls? And is Daedric magic different from ethereal magic? And is ethereal magic different from magic on Mundus? And now that we know what our goals are, let's not waste any more time and just jump right in. Like I do frequently in my videos, I'm going to outline creation very quickly for anyone who's not familiar. Keep in mind that this video could be someone's first. So it'll be a simplified version of the creation mythology for brevity's sake. During the Dawn era, all the gods are said to have originated in the magical plane of Aetherius. However, one day an Et'Ada named Lorkhan coerced a handful of deities to help him create the mortal plane of Mundus. What he didn't tell them was that the gods who helped use their powers to create Mundus would become trapped there. Magnus, the god of magic and Lorkhan's great architect of the mortal plane, was of the first to catch on to Lorkhan's omission. Magnus decided to abandon the project altogether, and he fled the mortal plane. Magnus and his followers, the Magicka, escaped Mundus by tearing through the veil that had been created, and escaped back to their home plane of Aetherius. In doing so, they created holes in the firmament that poke from Mundus through oblivion and into Aetherius. Magnus, being the chief god, left the biggest tear in the sky, which we now call the sun, and the various other Magicka who followed him appear as the stars. And it's through these tears in the sky that Magicka seeps through Aetherius and into Mundus. And according to some sources, it is Magicka itself that helped create the world and continues to this day to stabilize and weave together the various strands that make up the cosmos. So, what is Magicka? Well, a good way to think about Magicka is as a source of energy, or rather, a form of raw energy. Let me explain the concept of energy really quickly. I'm going to do my best since I'm a history guy first and foremost, not a physics dude. Essentially, in the normal world, where you and I reside, energy is the capacity to do work. You'll find this definition in any high school physics textbook. And work, in a scientific sense, can be defined as the transfer of energy to or from an object by exerting a force that causes a displacement of an object. Basically, applying force over a distance. The equation one can use to calculate work is W equals Fd, or literally, work equals force times distance. There are many different types of energy in our universe. Kinetic and potential are probably the most common that we all know from our middle school education, but there are several others. Mechanical, electric, magnetic, gravitational, chemical, ionization, nuclear, chromodynamic, elastic, mechanical wave, sound wave, radiant, rest, and thermal are all the types of energy that I could find, but maybe there's more out there that I just don't know about. This is all to say that if Magicka is defined as raw energy, what does that mean, and why is that not on our list? Well, raw energy is actually not a real thing, since it's always stored in some source and can only ever be transferred. Think about the chemical energy in your body that could be used to throw a baseball, transferring that chemical energy into making the baseball move with kinetic energy. So Magicka then, in a pure form, is kind of like an unstored energy, which again is not a real thing. It seems to be stored in Aetherius, I suppose, if anywhere else. But regardless, it's an extraordinarily interesting framework to view Magicka with. And since we know that it comes from Aetherius, that kind of leads to another interesting question about our world, and that is, where does real-world energy stem from? Energy in the real world is thought to come from the beginning of our current interpretation of the universe, whether that be from the Big Bang, some sort of a god, or somewhere outside or in between those two theories. I'm not here to debate cosmic origin or religion, though. Essentially, energy in the real world is a fundamental building block of our interpretation of the universe, regardless of your opinion on where it comes from, which has been there since the beginning of time. Magicka, similarly, stems from Aetherius in Elder Scrolls, which has existed since at least the dawn of time, since it's the plane from which the Aedra originated. Magicka, as we discussed, flows into Mundus from Aetherius, and is responsible for not only the creation of the Mundus, but also the creation of the soul. Unlike in our world, where the existence of a soul is debatable, Elder Scrolls has souls in a very real sense. A soul in the Orbis is typically associated with Aetherius, as Aetherius is said to be the plane of the afterlife. The most well-known plane of Aetherius to Elder Scrolls fans would be Sovngarde, which we visit ourselves in the Elder Scrolls V. So every creature with a soul, which is basically every creature outside of Daedra, anything with a connection to Enuic forces, has their own connection to the plane of magic. And it is through this connection with the raw energy of Magicka that people within the Elder Scrolls universe are able to manipulate this energy. To quote from Souls Black and White, "The nature of the soul is not knowable. Every wizard that has attempted it vanishes without a trace. What can be known is that souls are a source of mystic energy that can be harvested. Every creature, living or dead, is powered by a soul." What I think is really interesting here is the term mystic energy, as it actually gives us a term to use when discussing spellcasting/spellcrafting. So spellcrafting can be seen as a person using their connection with Magicka to tap into that raw source and transfer the energy into a different form. Mystic energy, in this case. So anytime that you summon a bound weapon, cast a firebolt, or use a spell shield to tank a hit, you're actually just transferring energy, or Magicka, and shaping it to your will. So this fantasy type of energy in the Elder Scrolls can be added to our list of real-life energies as well. Before we go further, we should talk about the other forms of energy in the series, just to really quickly tie up loose ends. So other forms of energy are obviously present in Elder Scrolls. You have chemical energy in flora and fauna, you have radiant energy through Magnus, the sun, which is no coincidence, and obviously you have kinetic and potential energy, and just all the regular stuff like that. We don't need to go into every single source. Rather than thinking that energy and Magicka are different things, though, I would actually argue that they are basically one and the same in the Orbis. It's just that Magicka exists in a raw form that can be tapped into by the denizens of the Orbis, and in our universe, it cannot. An important note about energy too is that it can't be created nor destroyed, just like matter, and this is apparent in Elder Scrolls as well. When you channel raw energy, or Magicka, you transfer that energy into mystic energy, which can take all different types of shapes and forms. So let's say you cast a firebolt. You're turning the raw energy of Magicka into mystic energy, which eventually burns off into thermal energy through the fire. Again, I'm not a physicist, I got a C+ in high school, but I hope you're still with me on this, and I hope you understand what I've been getting at here. The key points are basically that Magicka is raw energy that comes from Aetherius and seeps into Mundus. Every living being is infused with a part of etheric magic, the soul, which allows them to shape this Magicka into spells and effects through the transfer of this raw energy into mystic energy. Now that we have a good idea about what magic is, let's talk briefly about how it's cast. Magicka, as we've already established, is a part of the soul, of the very essence of the creatures of Nirn. But what does that truly mean? Well, the soul is split between the mind and the body, or rather shared in some sense. And there is obviously a difference between the two aspects. The mind, or the animus, of a soul provides thought and personality, where the body function only works to animate the muscles and movements of the creature. Think of a summoned zombie. It has the capabilities of movement and motor functions, but it lacks an animus. And in the reverse, we have the Augur of Dunlane, which seems to exist in animus alone, without a body.
He was a brilliant student, an accomplished wizard, delved into magic in a way none had seen before. But I think he became too focused on just how much power he could acquire.
So, spellcasting is a combination of animus and body. The soul is very complicated, obviously, but one thing that we absolutely can tell about it is that one's ability to control magicka is inherently physical to an extent, alongside mental. Spellcasting is a combination of animus and body for like 99% of all casters in the series. So for starters, how are most spells cast? I'll give you a second to think about it. Well, if you looked at the title of this chapter, you'd realize that most spells are cast with your hands, or a staff, or some kind of a gesture or physical notation. And this is interesting to me, and one of the questions that I was actually most wanting to find an answer to during the creation of this video. Do you guys remember that scene in Return of the Jedi where Luke makes C-3PO fly around to prove to the Ewoks that he's a god?
Tell them if they don't do as you wish, you'll become angry and use your magic.
Luke uses the Force here, but he actually doesn't use a hand gesture to do so. You can see Mark Hamill just sort of closing his eyes here and looking at C-3PO to do this magic. And I know that some Star Wars fans might get upset with me for calling the Force magic, but that's essentially what it is, right? And same thing within Doctor Strange. There's that guy that comes out and he doesn't have a hand, and then he starts casting magic. I don't know if you guys remember that scene, but I'll put it up on screen now. That scene has stuck with me since I saw that movie in theaters back in 2017, and I've always been left with questions about that which relate back to the Elder Scrolls, since we typically only see magic cast through hand gestures. And if we look at D&D, which inspired the Elder Scrolls, all spells are broken into 3 categories based on the components you need to cast them: verbal, material, and somatic. A verbal spell would be something like a Harry Potter-esque Expecto Patronum.
Expecto Patronum!
Very few spells require this in Elder Scrolls, with the Thu'um being the closest verbal spell system that I can think of. Then material spells require a physical component to be cast, like using an ember to summon a flame, or a diamond to conjure a genie, or something like that.
Give a diamond!
And then finally, there are somatic components to spells, and this is pretty much the only way to cast spells in the Elder Scrolls, and it's through some sort of a gesture. In the Lore Master's archive about the Arcanists, we hear from Azandar Alcibiades, I think that's how you say his name, I apologize if I messed that up, that the physical components of spellcasting are not de facto necessary to cast spells, but it does help significantly to focus the energies to where they need to go. If you were to cast an ice spike with mind alone, who knows where it might go? The Psijics are even said to have mapped out specific channels on the body through where magicka flows. And we can take a look at Oblivion's spell effectiveness mechanic to learn a little bit more. In The Elder Scrolls IV, the player character's spellcasting is inhibited if you wear armor, suggesting that limiting your body's movement with plate, or what have you, has a direct impact on your ability to cast efficiently. And to add on to this, I can't think of a spell I've ever really seen cast through Animus alone. It seems to be a union of body and mind together in most all instances. We can continue looking at gameplay to figure out more about the relationship that magicka has with our bodies, which is nice for a change, since usually gameplay and lore don't have much overlap in this series. Think about something as mundane and regular as the magicka bar. Every character has an inherent connection to magicka. Every character in Skyrim, for example, spawns with the healing and flame spell regardless of class or background, bare minimum. The lowliest peasant, the mightiest warlord, and the noblest of warlocks, all of their souls are made of the same stuff. However, some characters do have a larger Magicka bar than others, and some less so. Many races are even more attuned to Magicka than others, with the Altmer having the highest natural aptitude for magic. In fact, it seems like most of the elven races are magically attuned somehow, which could be taken as a harkening back to the Altmer religion's belief that the elves are closer to the gods in nature. So, is it true that all spellcasters will always be outclassed by the Altmer or by elven cultures? Or is it possible to learn and grow your magical potential over time? Well, obviously it is the latter of those two statements. You are able to grow your magical skill and even your Magicka bar over time. And just because you're an elf, I'll point out, does not mean that you're going to be practicing magic, right? I mean, look at this guy. Or this one. Having a higher potential means nothing if you don't strive to hone that skill. And there's also other ways to improve your base potential for your Magicka through just getting flatly lucky, honestly. Those born under the signs of the Mage, the Apprentice, or the Atronach have an inherently easier time casting spells than their peers in Elder Scrolls. Let's take a look back at the Lore Master's archive for an interesting thing about spellcasting and Magicka. Here, I'll just read it for you. The act of changing reality itself with the strength of your personality is exhausting. Every novice mage quickly discovers this upon attempting even the most basic of incantations. The personal reserve of Magicka novice mages possess is quite small, and it takes some time for this reserve to recover. As a weathered old hand at this hand-waving nonsense, my reserve is exceptional, but not infinite. So this is really cool as it reinforces more gameplay mechanics as lore accurate. For example, every time you level your skills in Morrowind and Oblivion, you have to rest, right? You should rest and meditate on what you've learned is a sentence that we've all become pretty familiar with at this point. And through this meditation and understanding and mastery, you can level your skills. And if you level intelligence, you'll raise your maximum Magicka. Makes sense, right? In Skyrim and even the Elder Scrolls Online, we have a simpler version of leveling up, but it remains pretty consistent between the two. Every time you level up, you can choose to raise your maximum Magicka, stamina, or health. It's a pretty simple concept to grasp. It even seems to be possible for a soul to accumulate more Magicka over a long lifespan.
The others have been singing your praises, but with a little more time, I would have gathered the Magicka to free myself. In another decade or so, it's hard to concentrate when you're on fire.
And this makes sense since, as we discussed, with time and experience, your Magicka can grow. But having a high Magicka soul, again, is nothing if you don't know how to cast spells. And this is where our Animus comes in to take over the Magicka reserves built up in the soul. Through your mind, you're able to study spellcraft, task and toil, and ultimately become a better caster. In gameplay, spells reflect this by becoming cheaper to cast as you level up in your skills, because your character is fundamentally understanding how to use that raw energy with them and around them better with every passing day. "I will teach you a powerful spell for breathing water," she said, "but you must become a master of it. As with all spells and all skills, the more you practice, the better you get. Even that ain't enough. To achieve true mastery, you must understand what it is you're doing. It ain't simply enough to perform a perfect thrust of a blade. You must also know what you are doing and why." And here is truly where we come to the crux of the biscuit here. Having Magicka is one thing, and learning spells is another. Again, it's the fusion of these two aspects of the soul that allows spellcasting to happen. And then there's willpower, which seems to have an inherent effect on spellcasting as well. Casting a spell is the act of channeling Magicka from within your personal reserves through your mind and will into the world. I quite like the appellation will worker, actually. It's a direct way to describe my profession. My brother is a person who farms, therefore he introduces himself as a farmer. I am a person who works via my will, therefore a will worker. Now, I think Azandar is being a bit too lenient and simplistic with how he's describing spellcasting, but I still really like the idea behind it. You do need to utilize willpower in order to form that raw Magicka within you in specific shapes and forms. And again, in old school Elder Scrolls, one of your abilities was named Willpower that you could level up every single time that you slept. Speaking of, there's many different ways to form raw etheric energy into mystic shape through will. Let's talk about them. To start, we'll need a brief history of the Mages Guild. The Psijic Order is the oldest order of spellcasters on Tamriel, and they lived a life of seclusion and perceived elitism on their island of Artaeum off the coast of Alinor. Once upon a time, two powerful Psijic monks were contemporaries on Artaeum. Historians would call them friends. These two were Mannimarco and Vanus Galerion. Mannimarco was eventually expelled from the Psijic Order for his profane practices in the art of necromancy, which were seen as repulsive and evil by the Psijic Order. Vanus, however, did not think the Psijic Order did the right thing by unleashing Mannimarco onto the citizens of Tamriel, and withdrew from the Order, going on to create the Mages Guild to teach the denizens of Tamriel so that they might educate themselves in the mystic arts. What once was an art form that was only known by a select few, spellcasting became a much more accessible and easy thing to learn once the guild was established.
He wanted the study of magic to be free. In doing that, he changed the course of life in Tamriel.
He codified the practices and rituals used by all modern potion makers, item makers, and spell makers, didn't he, great sage?
That was only part of it. Magic as we know it today comes from Vanus Galerion. He restructured the schools to be understandable by the masses. He invented the tools of alchemy and enchanting so everyone could concoct whatever they wanted, whatever their skills and purse would allow them to, without fears of magical backfire. Well, eventually, he created that.
Vanus took great effort to make magic easily understandable to the regular citizens of Nirn, and as such, he codified magic into different schools such that it might be easier to digest for lay people. This is the origin of the schools of magic, such as destruction, restoration, conjuration, alteration, mysticism, illusion, and thaumaturgy, alongside simplifications of enchanting and alchemical practices. And as the Mages Guild grew, these schools of magic became more and more commonplace to find and talk about throughout the continent. And mysticism and thaumaturgy being absent from more recent titles has nothing to do with these schools of magic themselves being abolished in lore. That is a straight-up gameplay feature, as those schools are still relevant and talked about in the lore. Same thing with many spells being missing in Skyrim. It's just because they simplified the magic system. Unlocking doors with magic is still very much possible in lore, for example, as is levitating. I mean, the worst piece of lore ever tells us that levitating is illegal now, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. And Skyrim removed mysticism so that way there would be an even 6 skills per playstyle. 6 warrior skills, 6 magic skills, and 6 thief skills. We all have problems with this, but it's whatever at this point. It's been like 13 years. True Elder Scrolls Enlightenment is not lamenting that mysticism was removed, but understanding that all schools of magic are just concepts of the mind. Mental structures to help mortals group together similar effects. But is there a metaphysical destruction school that fundamentally binds all destruction effects? No, not at all. A great way to look at this is spellcrafting in Oblivion. In Oblivion, you could combine an absorb health spell with a fire spell if you wanted to, and what exactly would you call that spell effect? It's not destruction, but it's not restoration. It's somewhere in between. To quote from the Black Arts on Trial, "The schools of Magicka are, as we know, artificial constructs originally formulated by Vanus Galerion to divide and thereby simplify study. They've changed many times throughout the years, but at their heart, every master knows they are all linked together. So, all magic is connected, and it's all really just transmuted versions of that raw energy that we call Magicka, shaped into different versions of mystic energy. The Psijic monks practice what they broadly call mysticism, also known to them as the Old Way, and I'm not convinced they mean the same thing as you and I do when they use the word mysticism. I'm more inclined personally to believe that this Old Way could be in reference to the ways in which magic was codified before Galerion's time that we as mere players are just not clued into. But Mysticism seems to derive power from its conundrums and paradoxes. The act of experimentation, no matter how objectively implemented, can influence Magicka by its very existence. Therefore, the mystic mage must consign himself to finding dependable patterns within a roiling imbroglio of energy. And yeah, we kind of have it all in this text block. Energy mentioned, being able to influence Magicka through any sort of study or experimenting, seems like a broad term for just all spellcasting, honestly. And conundrums and paradoxes are just a fact of the Elder Scrolls universe at this point. Mysticism was also home to what were called anti-magic effects, which are somewhat counterintuitive ideas. Spells like Reflect Magic, Silence, and Absorb Magic are all anti-magic effects, however, they still require Magicka to cast. Completely paradoxical in a way, but somehow not in a way that feels wrong. So mysticism is a school of magic that is pretty broadly important, but only when referring to the Psijic variation of it, I think. In Galarian's classification, it doesn't mean as much. Same with all the other schools. For instance, what's really the difference between restoration and, let's say, necromancy? Couldn't they both be classified as health magic instead? And why is reviving a corpse so much more different than saving a corpse through healing? Obviously, I know there are differences here, but I think you can understand my point. The schools of magic are helpful for learning, but arbitrary in the grand scheme of things. And there are so many types of magic that don't fit within Galarian schools as well. Take tonal magic, the Dwemer reality-altering sounds. Or the Thuum, the dragon tongue of shouting. Or again, necromancy, which Galarian inherently left out of his schools because he didn't like the practice. Indeed, in the Black Arts on Trial, necromancy is treated as a separate domain entirely, and is defended by pointing out that when a student of conjuration summons a guardian ghost, he's touching on the school of necromancy. When a student of enchanting uses a trapped soul, he too may be considered guilty of a black art. The school of mysticism, as I have stated before, has some kinship with necromancy as well. To state that students may not learn the ways of necromancy is to stifle common skills in the other, more historically legitimate schools of the guild. So let's take a look at some of these schools that don't quite fit in Galarian's mold. We have necromancy, tonal architecture, the Thuum, blood magic, dark magic, dream magic, flesh magic, hist magic, mycoturgy, nature magic, or druidic magic, and sword singing. And these are just a handful of traditions that don't really make their way into the games. I could go on and on as well. There's even something called cheesemancy, which we'll get into in a video that's coming out soon on the channel, just a little bit. Anyway, we have close places for some of these traditions, like necromancy, flesh magic. Those two kind of work with conjuration, but many of these other schools are just their own things. Like, where would you place hist magic? It doesn't really make sense to be put into a school in and of itself, because it's a very specific thing. Same thing with blood magic, since it's really only cast by vampires. Or the Thuum, for instance. There are some shouts that definitely fit into Galarian schools, like Fire Breath is obviously destruction. But what about Stormcall? Is that conjuration because you've summoned a storm? Is that destruction because it's a lightning storm? It hits a sort of foggy area, and the way the spell is cast is really what's separating it apart from the other domains, since shouting, at least how it appears in Skyrim, does not expend Magicka to cast. Tonal architecture, similarly, is more about the technique than anything else, as it's been said that tonal magic was used in Dwemer society for very different tasks, anywhere from mining to psychology, and these two skills are inherently verbal instead of somatic. With that said, again, Galarian schools of magic are effective for beginners, or for us as players to sort of level up our skills and choose a focused path of how to spellcast, but in the grand scheme of things, they're all just made up. And I also want to take some time to brush on alchemy and enchanting, which serve as supplementary magical skills in this series. We'll do alchemy first because, I don't know, it's alphabetically first. Alchemy is very interesting on Nirn because all ingredients, however mundane, can be turned into some sort of a potion. If you'd only ever played Skyrim, you'd be excused from knowing this, but in the older games like Oblivion and Morrowind, so many items had alchemical components which were, and still are, referred to as the 4 virtues of an ingredient. That's why almost all alchemy ingredients have 4 possible effects. Bread and cheese were alchemical ingredients alongside diamonds and Dwemer metal, and even still, eyeballs and honeybees back in the day. Everything in Elder Scrolls has some inherent magical potential that can be turned into a potion of some kind. The Nerevarine was really out there eating handfuls of raw glass and ebony, while the hero of Kvatch was stuffing their mouth full of scamp skin and ogre teeth. If you'd like to learn more about alchemy in the Elder Scrolls universe, by the way, you should really take a look at Hannah the Hermit, who has a channel that's largely based around botany and alchemy in this universe. I'll link her channel in the video description alongside a couple of other videos that I think are worth a watch. Also, if you want to learn a lot about cooking and alchemy in the Elder Scrolls universe, you should really read the Elder Scrolls novels, The Infernal City, and The Lord of Souls. I like to joke that they're the OG Elder Scrolls cookbooks before we got that new one in 2019. There's a lot of talk about cooking and alchemy in them. Anyway, moving on to enchanting. Think about enchanting for a moment with me, because I think I'm about to blow some of your minds with this. Enchanting is the art of taking a stolen soul within a soul gem and using its energy to imbue an inanimate object with a mystic energy of your choice. With everything we've discussed about Magicka and how it's formed, I really think enchanting is very cool, and honestly, somewhat morbid now that I really am thinking about it. It's basically like trapping a person's being, trapping a person's very soul, into your armor. In Morrowind, for example, enchanted items also regain their Magicka usage back if you wait long enough, just like how a denizen of Tamriel would regularly if they're not born under the Atronach Stone. Even in Oblivion and Skyrim, recharging them with other souls feels kind of nuts when you think about what you're actually doing. So both enchanting and alchemy were pioneered by the Durrani clan of Altmer before Galarian's time, but even different sects of enchanting are able to be seen by Ozidal's presence on Solstheim, which likely predates the Durrani clan. And that's not even to mention how many unknown enchanters and alchemists there have probably been since the dawn of time. Especially so with alchemy, as people have been eating food since the beginning of history. Anyway, what I think is cool about both of these practices is how they're both different ways of enhancing yourself through magical means, and they're both further proof that the body and soul are heavily connected with one another. But yeah, that's all I wanted to cover on that point. Basically, all magic is connected, so classifying it under different schools is only really helpful for beginners. If there's anything to take away from this section, it's that there's 3 sections of magic on Tamriel: spellcasting, alchemy, and enchanting. Everything else is semantics. So now that we're aware of what Magicka is, how to channel it, and many different types and shapes of this magic energy, I have a follow-up question. If Magicka comes from Aetherius and seeps directly into Mundus through the stars and the sun, what about Oblivion and the Daedra? How do they get their magic? So to start out, Daedra notoriously don't have souls. It has long been understood that a Daedra, who lacks the Anuic animus known as the soul, is not killed when its body is destroyed. A Daedra slain upon Mundus is merely banished back to its plane of origin, where its morphotype, or vestige, gradually forms a new body, so that eventually the Daedra lives again. This happens as well when a Daedra is slain in its native Oblivion. Now I can tell I'm going to get a little pushback here from some people because Daedra can obviously be soul-trapped. Unfortunately, this is one of those times where we have to understand that this series has been running for nearly 30 years, and some lore just gets confused by the writers, and we're also dealing with a Bethesda game here. It doesn't help that Dremora specifically are coded as NPCs since they have humanoid player models, so they're worth black souls in Oblivion and Skyrim since Bethesda didn't fix that issue between games. And of course you can soul trap all different types of Daedra such as the Atronachs, Clanfear, Scamps, everything like that. So yeah, this is an instance where we actually can't rely on gameplay for this option because all evidence goes against it. If I had to guess, I'd say that soul-trapping Daedric beings is a gameplay convenience for players that has simply never been taken into account for lore, but it shouldn't really be taken very seriously. Again though, getting back on track, the main reason that this is important is because if Daedric beings don't have souls, they're not connected to the Anuic force of Aetherius, and thus they shouldn't be able to access pools of Magicka. And what's interesting to further support this is that the Daedric cannot read Elder Scrolls, according to one of the Lore Master's archives, Elder Scrolls and Moth Priests. This Lore Master's archive states that the Ancestor Moths won't reveal the secrets of the scrolls to those who are not of Anuic origins. So, there are at least 2 in-universe theories for how Daedra are able to cast spells, and both are from the Lessons on Lucence lorebook from ESO's Deadlands chapter. And I actually really appreciate ESO for covering this topic because it's been something that I've been curious about for a while. I'm sure they won't tamper with this lore just 3 years after introducing it. So there's one theory that posits that when Magnus shot his way through Mundus and tore the firmament, there was a sort of explosion of Magicka that permeated throughout Oblivion, and it's that excess Magicka that allows the Daedra to cast spells. This is the Mundial Emanation theory, literally that Magicka emanated from Mundus into Oblivion. The next theory is known as the Manifest Dynamism theory, which theorizes that there's just some sort of omnipresent background force that gives Oblivion its laws in a similar way to how Magicka gives laws to Mundus and Aetherius. I prefer this Manifest Dynamism theory since I just don't like the idea of Daedra wielding etheric energy. I feel like they should have their own source or something. But like I alluded to already, both of these theories were seemingly forgotten by, say it with me, the Gold Road chapter. Okay, and listen.
Look here! Look, listen!
I'm getting a reputation with people as a guy who doesn't like ESO, and let me just show you my stats screen, okay? My Xbox playtime is on the left, and my PC playtime is on the right. So just hear me out, okay? I've played a lot of ESO, I like a lot of aspects of ESO, but I am going to call it out if it's being dumb or stupid. Every time. I'll call anything out if it's being dumb or stupid. Okay? That's my promise for you on this channel. Anyway, at the end of ESO's Gold Road chapter, spoiler warning if you actually want to play it, the Daedric Prince Athelia offers to banish herself to a distant, far-off reality in the multiverse where she won't be a threat anymore. You team up with Hermaeus Mora and discuss what to do with her. I streamed this live on the channel, so I'll just play this interaction for you.
If the threat to reality comes from your power, what about someplace where there is no power?
No power? A path where Daedra and Magicka do not exist? It would need to be a place where my Daedric power held no sway and could gain no foothold.
Okay, Athelia can find a distant reality without Magicka, where she would have no power and pose no harm. Wait. Are we suggesting that Athelia draws her power from Magnus, not from her Oblivion realm of Mirrormore? Why would she need to be away from Magicka? Is she casting spells using Magicka? I know that she's a Magna Gi, but she's a Daedric prince. She refers to herself as a Daedric prince. She refers to herself as a Daedra.
A nice thought. But I am Daedra.
Whatever. So yeah, this whole thing was just not really that well thought out, I think. In ESO's defense, Athelia was a Magna Gi, so if I wanted to steelman this position, we could say that she drew her power from Magnus at one point in time, since, again, she was connected to Magnus, but it still doesn't really work. She's a Daedric prince now, and in my eyes, a Daedric prince should not be drawing their power from Aetherius or from Magnus, especially when you have an in-universe book that has a better explanation for why Daedric can spellcast. And this actually makes sense because the Lore Master changed in between those expansions, where the Lessons on Lucence was dropped. Lehman Tuttle was the lead Lore Master during Deadlands, and is listed on UESP as the primary author of Lessons on Lucence, and then Michael Zenke fully took over around the time of Necrom. So yeah, it's just genuinely a mistake in the writing, and I'm happy to leave it at that. The UESP page on Magic is also really funny about this too. They have a section talking about basically everything that I just said, and then they end it with, Whatever the case, Daedra have referred to Magicka as a force they tap into to exert their power, and the only evidence they cite is Hermaeus Mora and Athelia talking in this Gold Road chapter from those 2 snippets I just showed you. Everything else in lore pretty much contradicts this conversation. So yeah, anyway, that's my Gold Road rant over, and this brings us to the topic of a not very well-known substance called Creatia, which we absolutely have to talk about here. This substance is so esoteric and unknown that it doesn't even have its own lore page on the UESP, as it only seems to come up in out-of-lore sources or very obscure places. However, according to a very recent piece of lore as of the creation of this video, we get an offhanded mention at the possibility that the Mundus was formed from Creatia by the Aedra. When the Aedra formed our realms from Creatia, did Shor abandon his creations? And Creatia seems to be like some sort of matter-based magicka, is the best way that I can put it, as it has a physical form and is used to be molded in different ways. But that's my own theory, don't take that as 100% fact. Again, there's not a whole lot about base Creatia. We also have the Numantia Intercept, hello again old friend, which talks about Creatia, saying that it flowed from Aetherius into the void, meaning oblivion in this instance. Not to get too deep into it, but the stones of the Towers of Tamriel are said to cultivate runoff Creatia from oblivion, since it's much more difficult to go directly to the source in Aetherius to gather this Creatia. So considering that the source is Aetherius for Creatia, it makes sense that this is some form of magicka that we're talking about. But now we need to get into something called chaotic Creatia, which honestly may or may not be the same thing as regular Creatia. It's very unclear, but I'm assuming they're different things. Chaotic Creatia is relevant to Daedra specifically, and just like all things Elder Scrolls, if it's Daedric, it gets a lot more lore than its Aedric counterpart. So regular Creatia we know was involved with the creation of the Mundus, and we know it originally comes from Aetherius and can flow into oblivion, but that's about it. Chaotic Creatia, then, is the building block of Daedric realms. We know this as a fact. We hear from Fanuit Hen that the Ideal Masters crafted the Soul Cairn from some pockets of Chaotic Creatia after they ascended to immortal beings. This substance is also what the various Daedra of the realms are made from. When a Daedra dies, its body is reformed using its Nimic blueprint in what's commonly referred to as the Waters of Oblivion. This is just another term for chaotic Creatia, and it manifests differently based on whichever realm you're in. Molag Bal's chaotic Creatia for reforming Daedra is seen everywhere throughout his realm as a bright blue liquid known as Azure Plasm, for instance. I'm sure you've seen it if you've played even the tutorial of ESO. So it's interesting because chaotic Creatia, to me, seems to support the manifest dynamism theory of Oblivion having its own background force that supports its physics. Mundus and Aetherius both seem to operate on Magicka and Creatia, and Oblivion then works off of chaotic Creatia. It's also entirely possible that the term just flat Creatia refers to chaotic Creatia that has already been formed into something. So then chaotic Creatia is that unformed chaos, which is why Daedra must return to it in order to become reformed. And this makes sense too, since when we travel to Oblivion, it seems to be running off of a very similar system of physics and energy to Mundus, at least from our perception. So it would make sense that the stuff that they're made of at least stems from the same stuff, or is similar in a sense to what we're made of. But I do still think it's very important to highlight that Daedra are disconnected from Aetherius, so they shouldn't really be using Magicka in the same way that mortals do. But they may have an extremely similar or adjacent source that they pull from to cast spells, since chaotic Creatia and Creatia may be causing different forms of energy. Daedrons are particles of chaotic Creatia that come into being when flowing in reaction to the exertion of will, which is very interesting. Perhaps Daedrons are to chaotic Creatia as Magicka is to regular Creatia? I'm not exactly sure. They're said to exist in Oblivion streams and have a profound effect on the Magicka potential of various locations. And, although they are said to be dangerous to mortal kind, they may still react to mortal wills. Also in the book, the Adabala, Daedrons are mentioned to potentially have some sort of alchemical component to them as well, which is interesting in and of itself. Like I said at the beginning of this, there's not a lot of information on Creatia or chaotic Creatia or Daedrons, so we'll just leave it at that, but it is something interesting to close this section on. And also, I didn't really know where to throw this in, so I guess it fits here. Molag Bal is credited with the creation of soul gems, which makes sense since he's known as the Harvester of Souls, and is generally in the business of collecting and dominating etheric souls. It also further just makes me feel bad about every piece of armor I've ever enchanted. Soul gems can be seen littered across Cold Harbor, in boxes and bins alike, so this seems legit to me, although it immediately makes me think about Azura's Star. Again, not that I have a lot to say about it, but it would be kind of funny if Azura's most well-known artifact was just some random tool that Molag Bal forgot about. But yeah, okay. I think I've touched on everything that I wanted to. This has been kind of a little bit more casual of a run-through, but let's run the conclusion chapter. Special shoutouts as well to my channel members for sticking with me and choosing to donate a portion of their income to support the work done on this channel. I have names up on screen as we discuss this final wrap-up. So what have we learned here today? Well, honestly, I feel more enlightened after writing this script, so I hope you all feel more enlightened after having listened to me read it out loud. We've talked a lot about how Magicka is actually just an energy source that sort of runs parts of the physics in Elder Scrolls. We talked about how that raw energy is utilized by mortals, and how a similar version may be manipulated by Daedra. We discussed the classification of spells and how to cast them, both physically and mentally. So, a lot of good stuff. Originally, this video was actually going to be far longer, and I cut out a lot of it that was just pointless to me. Basically, I was going to have sections going over alteration, conjuration, destruction, and so on and so forth. But then I just decided partway in to take the angle that all schools of magic are made up anyway, so I condensed large parts of that segment, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please let me know if you feel like you learned something here. Importantly, always let me know if I get something wrong. The entire segment on Daedric magic versus etheric magic was definitely confusing, and I wouldn't be surprised if I got something wrong about chaotic Creatia, but I do think I did my homework pretty well at least. In the end, though, I think this next quote really summarizes this endeavor to figure out Magicka.
When studying magic, one must simply accept that certain factors of Magicka will elude one perpetually. Fortunately, for those times there are individuals like myself, willing and able to guide others towards understanding.
And honestly, with that in mind, I think we did a pretty good job getting to the bottom of this whole Magicka thing here today. Please tell me if you feel like I guided you towards a better understanding of this concept, or if you're just as confused as when you started. Also, please leave me a comment about your favorite spell effect in the series, and use the word Daedron somewhere so I know you made it this far. That's 1-800-DAEDRON. And if you feel like sticking around for further content, please subscribe. It would mean a lot. My favorite spell, by the way, is either Absorb Health in Oblivion, Jump in Morrowind, and probably like Bound Bow in Skyrim. Anyway, I've been Dariloth, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Peace out.